Okay, great. Why don't we start? Mark, welcome. I am Marissa Brown. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. Thanks so much for joining us today. And before I introduce Mark, I'd like to read our land acknowledgement in our department, and then I will introduce Mark and his talk. So before we start, I'd like to address the issue of the land that Brown University and this department occupies. A process that has been underway at Brown for a little over a year now to create a meaningful acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples and their connections to this land. The process will take time, deliberation, and care to ensure that the acknowledgement follows Indigenous protocols and addresses meaningful action. As this work continues with the guidance of our colleagues at the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative, it's important to acknowledge our own center's relationship to displacement and settler colonialism and their legacies today, and to reiterate our continued commitment to supporting the work of Indigenous knowledge keepers, artists, scholars, and storytellers through our curriculum, programs, and partnerships. Mark Krasovic joins us today from Rutgers, where he is Associate Professor of History and American Studies at Rutgers University, Newark. He is the lead PI on the project that he is sharing today. He received his PhD in American Studies from Yale University in 2008. His research and teaching interests center on the cultural and political history of the modern United States, urban history, and the public arts and public humanities. His first book, The Newark Frontier: Community Action in the Great Society, examines how the structures of 1960s liberalism confronted the perceived crisis of America's cities. His current book project explores federally funded arts projects in the 1960s. Mark is deeply committed to projects and to community organizations in Newark. He served as the local Newark coordinator for the Federal Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. He was a co-sponsor of the This is Newark Public Symposium on Urban Design and a facilitator for the New Jersey Council for the Humanities statewide film series, and also sits on the executive board of the Newark Historical Society, the education committee of the Newark Museum. So this is actually our last spring semester speaker series speaker. The title of the series this semester was Public Humanities and Place. And all of our speakers in one way or another have addressed the relationship between where they sit in terms of where they are doing public humanities work and place, whether that be the institution that they work in or the city and community that they're working in. So I think it's fitting to end with you, Mark, because I think one question, we are always asking in public humanities is whether this work can really be done effectively without deep and long and meaningful connections to a place. And so clearly you bring that to this work. And so I think as we kind of continue to think about that, it'll be wonderful to hear your presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Marissa. And I didn't realize that I was the final one of the semester, so I hope I'm a worthy conclusion to this great series. And I want to start too. It sounds like we're institutionally in a similar place with a land acknowledgement that is very much in process and not finalized. So I begin by acknowledging that my university and the city that it calls home are located on the ancestral lands of the still living Lenape people. I pay respect to Indigenous people throughout the Lenape diaspora. And I also want to acknowledge that these lands have been the site of colonial violence, of occupation, dispossession, enslavement, that has impacted the lives of all to this very day. And so I really want to thank Marissa and everybody at the John Nicholas Brown Center for inviting me to speak about one effort to deal with some of those impacts and about some reflections on the practice of the public humanities in this work. And I really appreciate these sort of public humanities gatherings because I think these projects are often are just very complicated collaborations and networks of partners that kind of have a life and a movement of their own, and sometimes hard to stop and pause and think about, what is worth reflecting upon further. And so thank you all for being here, for listening to this, for your interest. And I look forward to talking to you after my presentation and hearing your thoughts and questions. So let me share some slides real quick. Okay. So this effort in Newark grows out of the Mellon Foundation's Just Futures grant program. Oh, sorry, I meant to put these up earlier. This is the approximate location of our city and campus on Lenape land. So the project I'm talking today comes out of the Mellon's Just Futures grant program. And like many Mellon programs, it's based in the belief that the humanities have a key role to play in addressing contemporary pressing issues and challenges. And the Just Futures program invited calls from, this is the language they used, multidisciplinary, university-based teams across the US who are committed to racial justice and social equality. And I noticed too that Brown Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice also received one of these grants for a project called Reimagining New England Histories. So if anybody here knows about that, I'd love to hear more about it. So the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan, and this is Earl Lewis, historian, former head of the Mellon Foundation. This is his shop at the University of Michigan. Coordinated a proposal called Crafting Democratic Futures, Situating Colleges and Universities in Community-Based Reparations Solutions. And essentially it created a network of now approximately 9 partners, mostly on the eastern half of the US, a sort of variety of schools and places, but each one of the partners in this network will devise a local reparations plan that is both research informed and community engaged. And what this means at each one of these sites is very different. Some are focused on very particular episodes and phenomena in history. Some, like us in Newark, are attempting to tell a very broad history of racial harms on which we can base our case for racial reparations. And each team at each one of these locations comprises people from the college or university and some community fellows. So at Rutgers Newark, as Marissa said, I'm the lead co-PI, which essentially means I'm the one who does the administrative grunt work of paying bills and hiring people and things like that. And my co-PI on this is Professor and Dean Timothy Eatman, who some of you may know was the director of Imagining America for many years and is now the inaugural dean of the Honors Living Learning community at Rutgers Newark, which is a sort of innovative alternative honors college that values social engagement and social justice activities over and above GPAs and test scores. So that's the core of the team at Rutgers Newark. We have many other faculty and staff and student partners, and some of them I'll talk about in a little bit. And then our community fellows, one is a team from the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. This is a research, policymaking, and advocacy group that is a statewide organization, but is headquartered in Newark. And they focus on 3 areas: economic justice, criminal justice reform, and democracy and justice. And their president and CEO, Ryan Haygood, is one of the community fellows. And then from their economic justice team, Laura Sullivan, who's kind of a policy person, and Jean-Pierre Brutus, who's one of the lawyers on staff, are 2 of our closest partners in this reparations work. There we go. Their economic justice work, includes research. So if you went to their website, which is njisj.org, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, you'll see a whole series of reports that they have researched and released and are frequently updating. And this is a graphic that we've gotten a lot of mileage out of in the Reparations project, focusing especially on that second stair from the bottom, the median net wealth of white residents versus that of Black and Latinx residents in New Jersey. And it's just kind of a stunning gap that, when we put this up, often shocks people. It is shocking. And one way that some people have thought about reparations is that we could just choose such a statistic as this, approach it as a legacy of a long history of racial harms, and think about how we could close this racial wealth gap. And that alone would be a significant form of repair, of reparations. So this is often like an idea that we lead with, though we're not limiting ourselves to that, but to get sort of discussions started. The Institute also does a lot of advocacy work, especially on a campaign for state legislation that would establish a New Jersey task force to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans in New Jersey. That's the language from the official bill summary. So you see Ryan Haygood, our community, one of the community fellows, at a press conference in Trenton. They also are leading a statewide campaign, Say the Word, which has been made into t-shirts and social media presences and posters and events, marches, picketing, protests. And I sort of love this picture for several reasons, but I'm just want to call your attention to the one sign all the way over on the left, reparations equals repair the nation, which is kind of a phrase that bounces around my head constantly. So I'll leave that there for now. So New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, one of the main community partners on this project. The other is the Newark Community Development Network, which is a consortium of all the major neighborhood-based community development corporations in Newark, which are by and large very, particularly neighborhood-based. So there is an ironbound community corporation over on the east side of the city, and you'll see on this neighborhood map. The new community corporation, which is sort of covers the Fairmount, University Heights, and other areas in the city. Out to the west, Unified Vailsburg Service Organization covers that little shard of Newark that sticks out to the west. Virtually every neighborhood you see here has some sort of community development corporation or other type of organization that is represented on the NCDN, along with other local anchor institutions, including Rutgers Newark, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, the Newark branch of the NAACP, and other such advocacy and activist organizations. And they've been meeting monthly for over 30 years now in Newark. And their chair and sort of the guy who runs and organizes these monthly meetings is our other community fellow, Richard Camerari, who's the guy all the way over on the right in this picture. And this is a photo, I believe, of a sort of subgroup of the NCDN that focuses on housing issues. This is not the entire network, but it's some of them. And Richard is a Newark native, a Rutgers Newark alum, has been a community organizer in the city since the 1970s. He knows and respects everyone, and everyone knows and respects him. And his main role in the project has been organizing a series of community dialogues around reparations, something each of the Crafting Democratic Futures teams across the country seem to be doing in one form or another. But in Newark, they've been of two kinds mostly, these dialogues. A sort of preliminary set of dialogues, so kind of planning dialogues with the staffs and leadership of some of these neighborhood organizations. And we're now transitioning from those planning dialogues into the actual sort of larger community dialogue events. But they are not huge. In fact, the planning process, one of the results of that was one of the things we discovered is that there's like zero appetite for big, like raucous town hall like meetings. We were very strongly advised not to organize those, that those might be counterproductive. So those are that's how the team is comprised. And I just want to go back to the university for one sec. we serve two main roles in the project: the administrative hub for the grant, of course, and we also are leading the historical research effort. I'm essentially a historian. This is the thing I know how to do. And we've hired a team of students, both graduates and undergraduate students. And during the first year of the project, which is 2021, they focused mostly on online digital resources that they could get from home while we were still largely learning remotely, and while a lot of local repositories were closed or had very limited hours. And then just finally this semester, we were able to finally get some students into the Newark Public Library, the New Jersey Historical Society, which are both within walking distance of our campus, which you see here in this picture. And so we've been slowly, or I should say, I've been slowly developing a sense of how to teach and train teams of student researchers. And it turns out, I know how to do my own research, but organizing and leading a team is a different beast altogether. So I would really value any thinking here about, or any experiences here about how to do that and what's worked and what hasn't. But so in addition to these research teams, another question I've been thinking about lately is about the place of the humanities, and really in the case of our project, historical research, in the reparations process. There are many different models of reparations kind of out there in the world. This one comes from an outfit called Liberation Ventures, which has been enlisted by the people at the University of Michigan to help frame and create a common language across the network of institutions on this grant for the reparations projects. Consists of a cycle of redress, reckoning, acknowledgement, and accountability in a constant, reiterative, circular process, not linear. Or another, popular model, take William Darity and Kirsten Mullen's ARC model from their, sort of landmark, fabulously important book, From Here to Equality. That is ARC, A-R-C, acknowledgement, redress, repair, enclosure. So, but the question here is, in these reparations processes that often include reckoning, or in some cases, acknowledgement, as the space in which humanities researchers are most often imagined to intervene, what significant historical shifts or additions to historical knowledge might grow out of local place-based historical research to help drive the repair process? So, put another way, what good is the historical research here? Or again, what good is the humanities? What exactly are we doing here? Or, thought of more broadly, of what use is a firmly, stubbornly local place-based public history humanities practice here? And this is both a process question, how do we do this in general? How do we do this with community partners, with students? And a content question, about the value of local history. So we've organized the research into the now very familiar periods of slavery, segregation, mass incarceration, and have small teams of student researchers sort of assigned, or they chose one of those areas to focus their efforts on. And maybe some of you in Providence and other cities feel similarly, but that is, to us in Newark, there's just not a lot of historical scholarship on Newark, especially its earliest couple centuries. But even the 20th century stuff, including my own book, has tended to crystallize around the 1960s. So it often feels like we're kind of starting from scratch, or that we're guided by earlier waves of historical writing that are more boosterish than critical. So one way we've asked students to approach the research is to read broad overviews of those historical periods and phenomena from other cities and kind of reverse engineer that scholarship. So for example, many of them have read Intro to the collection of essays, Slavery in New York, or the first chapter of Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. The chapter is If San Francisco, Then Everywhere. These are both very accessible overviews of their topics, grounded in particular American cities. And students come away from that asking, different versions of a very basic question, which is something like, X happened there, did it also happen in Newark? And if so, how, when, and what did it look like here? And so we're sort of rather shamelessly lifting and through research adapting received frameworks from other places. And we don't expect any bombshell historical finding that is going to change the face of historical scholarship on slavery or segregation or the carceral state. One of the most basic definitions of the public humanities that we often use here at Rutgers Newark, and that really grew out of discussions when our graduate program in American Studies was creating a public humanities MA track. That definition is that public humanities are forms of humanities scholarship that respond to local community hopes or needs or desires, questions that are raised because they are meaningful in Newark, not because there's a gap or some error in the scholarship that needs filling. So I've come to think of public humanities as valuing and honoring kind of a different register of novelty than traditional academic humanities most often does. Not novelty in the sense of the broad contours and frameworks of a field of study, but in the details that those frameworks help us see and that fill them out, whether or not those accumulated details then push against the frameworks in ways that significantly alter them. So this different register of novelty sort of really grew out of our sense of this, and I don't even know if register is quite the right word here. We're still working on the language. But whatever this insight, such as it is, it grows out of our experience with these community dialogues that we've been holding. And so just to give you like a sense of these, again, most of these dialogues are hosted by particular neighborhood organizations, and they draw upon the neighborhood constituents of those particular organizations. And sometimes, and perhaps this will become more common as the dialogues grow in number, we've been hosted by religious institutions, labor groups. We have one coming up with a youth group that might not be so neighborhood based. So the last one that I attended in person was hosted by Ahava Shalom, which is the last remaining synagogue and Jewish congregation in Newark. But it was a co-production of that synagogue and the Clinton Memorial AME Church, which is right next door. So according to Richard, who is the only person who has attended every one of these dialogues, this was the first multi or really biracial community dialogue we had. And it was not confined to a particular neighborhood because these congregations pulled from various areas of the city and even the region. So in these dialogues, listening to Newark residents and others and what they know about history, how they think about reparations, we've been challenged to demonstrate that our research is actually useful to them and to the reparations movement. And we realize that historical reckoning or acknowledgement itself has different registers or dimensions, and that the community fellows, the organizations they represent, the people they've organized into these dialogues, have by and large been doing the work of repair or redress in Newark for decades. And many residents we've been meeting can trace their families back in Newark a century or more. So they don't need a history lecture on slavery or segregation or urban renewal or policing or incarceration. They have broad familiarity with all these topics, whether through their own study or sometimes through personal or family experience. And yet we have this grant money dedicated to student researchers, and we've nevertheless launched a historical research effort into the history of racial harms in Newark. So we've only in very limited ways so far brought some of the archival material that we've been digging up before these larger groups of Newark residents. So this is kind of a work in progress. But those encounters that we have had have led us to, maybe a somewhat tentative but a hopeful place. And that place is where we're now thinking about the power of specifically local archival materials and how they occupy a space between the broad national picture of, say, slavery and any potential personal or family histories of it. In Newark, which despite the efforts of many people has gaping holes in its historiography, local history is often a missing dimension of historical knowledge and experience. And based on very strong, and we're all sort of wrapping our brains around some of these moments, but very strong sort of emotional intellectual responses to that we've witnessed, responses to this archival material, it seems to be one thing to know that slavery existed in Newark, as virtually everybody we've met has known. It's another thing to encounter archival vestiges of it in the context of a public conversation about reparations. So this is one of the first things that we started showing, and it's since been tweeted out and reproduced, and it's sort of taken on a life of its own. And we have at least dozens of these ads for runaway enslaved people. And the first time we showed this at a larger meeting, a gentleman in the crowd who I've since come to know a bit, said, again, somebody who knew already that slavery had existed in Newark, he looked at us, he said, Will, he's 49 years old. I'm also 49 years old. He was about 5 feet 8 inches high. That's about my height too. A bold, daring fellow. That's how I would describe myself. And he just kind of latched onto this in this very powerful and very personal way. And he since has joined the research team. So we've just, we were so struck by kind of the energy and the emotion of this response that this is what we're really thinking about, like what that response kind of means. Similarly, another common thing that we've been collecting are various real estate ads in both Newark and suburban newspapers, especially ones that mark properties or neighborhoods as restricted. Some of these are very explicit that this is a racial restriction, and there are restrictions of all sorts of types, but typically when they just use the word restricted, racial restriction was understood or implied there as well, or was part of the basket of restrictions that were applied to this area. And so I use this one a lot because it's kind of visually remarkable. The architecture, the name of the town, Hohokus, which is way up in northern New Jersey, and is a Lenape word, though nobody can seem to agree on a Lenape word for what. And when we've shown ads like this, especially for towns right around Newark, people often recognize the neighborhoods or the streets. We haven't had anyone recognize a particular home yet, but this just like registers with them in some different way than just knowing that redlining or racial covenants or blockbusting happened, which by and large people have known already. So again, we haven't totally wrapped our brains around what this means, but I am struck by how these individual artifacts in a way short circuit narrative, in the sense that in historical narratives, whether they're familial, scholarly, whatever, the past comes before us in a narrative flow, oftentimes chapters or pages or paragraphs before our present. And this is for sure not to be dismissive of narrative, of course. We still very much need to do the how we got here from there thing. We still need to connect the dots in our reparations report. But there's value in these moments of public encounter that seem to collapse history, to bring far-flung moments together in ways that suggest they're not so far-flung after all. So this gentleman seeing himself in Runaway Will, and vice versa, or realizing that the neighborhood you drive through, when you're bringing your daughter to basketball practice in the 1930s was a racially restrictive neighborhood. So, I think people, not people here, I'm sure, but like people in general, often talk about local history somewhat dismissively, as a territory of hobbyists. But based on these powerful responses to archival materials that embody broad histories, but in very familiar places and in place-specific ways, we're now thinking about local history as a critical dimension of how historical research and knowledge can help drive the reparations process. And we're gaining some sense of where this material fits into people's processing of these histories. And again, that is somewhere between the personal, familial level and the much broader contours and narratives of history. So that's kind of like my first reflection. I have a new appreciation for what local history can do, what it can mean for people in a particular place, when it's taken seriously, when it's rigorously researched, and when it's brought before people who are familiar with their place in some of its dimensions and familiar with some broad historical narratives, but have not seen how those two dimensions, the local and the national, or the broad and the very specific, intersect in archival vestiges of racial harms. I have two more reflections that I'll just kind of like race through, and that's the end of the slideshow, I'm afraid. But if I could just zoom out for a second to a tension or a debate that sometimes roils the reparations movement, there are some, William Darity for starters, who have questioned the value of these local reparations efforts, such as those connected under the Just Futures grant. And the arguments vary, but they're often about how the federal government is the only body that can meaningfully pay reparations, and that any efforts aimed elsewhere are drawing energy from that one truly meaningful reparations effort. So even while harms are inevitably experienced locally, in specific places where they might take broadly similar, but always slightly different forms, the perpetrators and solutions are not always imagined as such, as local. And on first hearing, catching wind of some of these arguments, even before we began this project in earnest, it kind of struck me as wrong-headed, in the sense that, when you think about the history of social movements in the US broadly, they suggest a productive interplay among national, state, and local efforts. And it's worth noting that in New Jersey, we have that state legislation that's kind of stuck in Trenton, stuck somewhere in committee. But it was one of may have been the first state level bills introduced. It was introduced before California's was introduced, even though California's has since been passed, and their task force has been holding hearings and making real headway. But now that we have about a dozen community dialogue sessions under the project's collective belt, such synergy among those different levels of place, if you will, seems abundantly clear. The dialogues and the participants in them suggest that this tension is really a false one. The political imaginations of our so-called local informants are not confined to the local or the municipal. The community dialogues have covered the breadth, the range from big national ideas about what reparations can look like and knowledge of big national historical narratives, to the very hyper local, not just Newark, but Newark neighborhood-based ideas and proposals in histories. So it's not as if people exist in only one of those dimensions. They are not only local residents. And it seems to me that in designing this project, we didn't always think about the community in that way, as this multidimensional. But they are clearly, more than local informants, end of story. So at the same time, we know that the people who come to the community dialogues are archives unto themselves. They carry stories and objects from history with them. And so we haven't actually begun this work yet for reasons of our IRB approval process at Rutgers. But we plan to follow up with people from these dialogues through smaller focus groups and oral history interviews. Those people who inevitably tell us things like, as I heard at Hava Shalom a week ago, my family goes back to 1865 in Newark. And we, of course, in doing this, will be mindful of institutional histories of extraction, meaning, the taking out of things for the benefit of others. And I'm not totally convinced there's a way to avoid some level of extraction in that sense. This is my job. I get paid for this. I enjoy this. I benefited from it in some ways, as does Rutgers as an institution. But our main mode of thinking is more about reinvestment, that what is one person's family history can be redeployed as another person's local history, in the sense that I've been talking about it here. And that is the reason why we are collecting oral histories or archival artifacts. But you let me know if that seems too easy, too easy and out to this really, kind of perilous question of institutions' relationships to the communities they call home. So in that, in turn, of course, this allows for a deeper engagement and familiarity with the history of racial harms in Newark. And the article of faith here, which may seem, kind of an obvious thing, even if I wouldn't know how to evidence it exactly, is that those types of engagements, with the history are educational for sure, but they're also mobilizing. That, not so much to me, but to people like Richard who know how to do this sort of thing, that they help make the ground more receptive to our organizing efforts. And that there's this faith that the resonance of our work in Newark might not stop at city borders, but that our project might constitute a particularly energetic node in the larger network of reparations work that stretches across the country, and whose possibilities and power are enhanced for having turned some of its attention to very local places. So thanks for listening, and I'm just more than happy to take questions and thoughts. And again, thank you all for listening and for being here.
I'm seeing, yeah, this was an amazing presentation and work. And also, I'm just going to say something quickly, because I know I'm seeing people here who I know are going to have brilliant things to say and also have questions as Providence is kind of engaging in some of this work. But I think, everything you said is resonating here, especially kind of this gap in local history and kind of that, having to rely on those sources, as you said, they're boosterish, and this lack of critical local history is something that we experience in Providence. And then I think for those of us on this Zoom who really think about public humanities, this focus that you and at Rutgers, that it is specifically geared to responding to local community desires and needs, which isn't always the case in public humanities. To me, it's sort of the most compelling way to do it. And so also just sort of this thinking about how that work can drive a process outside of the university as important as reparations is just, you've put out a lot that is resonating here and really inspiring. But I'm sure there are other people who have questions and comments. So if you do, here actually, people can unmute themselves. So go ahead to do that, or raise your hand icon, whatever you feel comfortable with, or use the chat. Anne, yeah, go ahead.
This is fascinating, Mark, and really very helpful. I wonder if you have been able to access the charts on redlining and the way for people to study, as we have now in Providence, and seen how it wasn't just red lines, it was yellow lines and blue lines and green lines, and that was a federal project to identify those neighborhoods that were then going to be wiped out for the interstate highway. And that some of that study of redlining, when you actually see the maps and you compare them to where the homes of color were, and see how those communities were wiped out, it reinforces what Darity and Mullen are saying in From Here to Equality about the fact that it was a federal project and that there needs to be a federal solution in addition to the local solutions. But I think that would dovetail very nicely with helping people in the neighborhood to begin to envision what's happened in their own place.
Yes, thank you for that, Anne. And yes, we have, redline, and maybe it's because the maps are so kind of accessible, they're like kind of easily readable in one way, that history seems to have taken on a life of its own. Like, people really know that stuff. When we have these community meetings, they come pretty well versed in redlining. So we have downloaded the Essex County map, and we had a graduate student who since had to drop out of the project because she needed to make progress on her dissertation, but who started asking like really great questions of the maps. And one was she wanted to see if how to phrase this, if all of the red areas in Newark or all of the yellow areas in Newark were actually how similar they were. Like what was, for Newark, the actual like most predominant variable that determined whether something was red or yellow. I mean, we presume, and if you look at the surveys that they collected with like residential and demographic information that are coded to areas on the maps, they were certainly thinking about race, but she really wanted like to hone in on this and create a statistical analysis of what those neighborhoods actually looked like. And that's sort of a bear of an undertaking, but that's one thing she was doing. And then she raised a really great question and almost got to an answer. And I think we've taken it a bit further. But to your point about this is a federal program that was like enacted locally, we really wanted to know, so who were the local actors in this, or were there any? Was it just the federal government sending people from Washington to these places and they were creating these maps, or what role did the Newark Housing Authority play in this? And so it looks like, there were local people hired to do these surveys. So they were actually based on, as far as, I'm saying this kind of tentatively, wait till the written report comes out and we will have like decided what we think about it. But it seems like, they were very much based on these local actors deploying their local knowledge of these neighborhoods, which includes their local biases. And so who exactly those surveyors were and how they did their work, and what their role and responsibility is in creating the racial harm of redlining is something we're just trying to figure out in like great detail. And that comes mostly actually in Newark from newspaper accounts, because the city archives, in like the sort of classic story, had like a flood or a fire at some point, and in particular, their housing records are incredibly minimal, like shockingly minimal, the records from the Newark Housing Authority. And it's a real shame for historians, especially that those aren't there. So yeah, so we are approaching redlining for sure, but trying to figure out what specifically the local dimension of it was. And then of course there's proposals to, layer, as everybody's doing. I see like headlines in the newspapers quite commonly about, a different city has layered their redlining map over a map of flood areas or lead poisoning areas, and see how they correlate. So there are proposals to do that with, we had one guy working on brownfield and Superfund sites in Newark and seeing what would happen if we layered those maps. So we're thinking about those correlations as well.
One of the correlations in Providence was that one of the banks that ended up building on a spot at University Heights that had been black homes, essentially, had to pay a significant fine for having redlined against homes of people of color and funded only white homes, or primarily white homes, and ended up paying significantly for that.
Do you know when was that fine? And
it's very recent.
Okay.
Very recent.
Okay.
I'd have to send that to you.
Up.
I'll get your email and send it to you.
Oh, I love it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put it in chat.
Sure.
Go ahead, Julie. I think you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
How's that? Can you hear?
Perfect.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This was fantastic. Two of my absolutely two favorite institutions, the Brown Center and programs and the Newark Center programs to meet in. And there are those of you who know the Imagining America history and the report on tenure policy, a much read, little acted on, I must say, but that Tim Eatman and I did together back in the day. So, nice. so Rutgers Newark is a place where I've had, it's kind of a home going back to when Clem Price was on the advisory board of Imagining America. So this is my roots, and brothers and sisters moment. So it's great to be here. I want to shift from like a really concrete question, like the red, yellow, green lines on the so-called redlining, which I found fascinating, to lead to a kind of conceptual framing that I've been wrestling with. But first, I just wanted to mention, Mark, you probably know this already, but the Rita Chin and others in the history department at the University of Michigan have started this program called the History Labs program, and it's a way it's a way to have undergraduate researchers doing project-based work in the context of a course, and it can a history lab can be proposed by a faculty member or a graduate student who has a partner or a network outside the university or outside the academic zone, and a way to connect it to the content of the course. So there's, you just might find that interesting because it offers different, a different way for students and graduate students to, and faculty to kind of, enter into the kind of work you're doing in a way that who knows whether these curricula are sustainable years later, but it's a good idea. So the question I wanted to ask, it has to do with really taking on the term public humanities. I am, of course, have been both a passionate advocate for the public humanities, but I'm also have been astonished at the speed with which it's become the term, like the term under which humanists, are sort of gathering and developing programs, all of which I think are great. But at the same time, I think we need to think who is not using that term, who is not identifying or defining their mission in terms of that term. And so I have running lists. I've started to use just the term knowledge center. And I have a particularly long list of Black knowledge centers. So that's the notion of shifting from public humanities to knowledge centers doing public work or publicly, in all the 1,000 connotations of the word public. The other thing I found really interesting that kind of slices it differently comes from a book I think is just indispensable, which is Patricia Hill Collins' Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory. And she has this analysis of critical knowledge projects and resistant knowledge projects. They're both knowledge projects. They tend to map on to knowledge projects have a specific change, agenda, whereas a critical knowledge project may not be issue-based or tactic-based in the same way. But the epistemological politics of that, I think, combined with thinking about Black knowledge centers that aren't necessarily trading in the term public humanities. Like, who else is out there outside that rubric? And what can we learn from them? And so I don't know if this is resonating for anybody else, and I'll shut up now because I talk too much.
Not at all. I think that's great. And thank you for that, Julie. And I'll just add real quick for you, the only reason why I'm at Rutgers Newark was because Clem Price advocated to hire me. Anyway, I'll start crying if I start talking about him too much. But yes, thank you for that language. I do think it is, if you noticed on the first slide that had the full name of the project, which I'm not sure how that name came about, but it's, crafting democratic futures, situating colleges and universities and locally based reparations work, or that's roughly it. And right, our community fellows, and let alone the people that we meet at these dialogues, could not possibly care less about like where colleges and universities are really situated in like a larger sense. They care about what I do. They care about what my colleague Tim Eatman does. But they're not terribly interested in those larger conversations. And I think, like, and maybe this is what you're saying, like public humanities tends to be what we use in the academy, but I don't think it has much resonance to the folks, to our partners on this project. So there's like, it's almost like we're engaged in a side discussion as we're having these larger community discussions about reparations. And that is about university, campus-based public humanities and how we can act as academics in, a responsible and effective, in just way. So, but I love and thank you for that, the sort of alternative language of knowledge centers. I think I would like to think that that's how we think about it, even if we did not have that language available. But I may, if you don't mind, just kind of use it from now on, and I could footnote you. So.
Tracy, I think you had your hand up. Did you have a question? And then I think after that, Silas, you also had your hand up following Tracy.
Yes, hi, thanks. I'm just listening in. I am an alum of the Taubman Center, Masters in Public Affairs, but I was born in Elmwood Park, New Jersey. I wasn't planning to make this personal connection, but it just occurred to me. And my first memory of activism is when I was 8 years old. My mother took me around knocking on doors. The town was originally named East Patterson, and there was a movement to change it to Elmwood Park to disconnect from the association with Patterson. So I am totally with you that local history is key to understanding these past injustices. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great, thank you. I didn't know that about Elmwood Park and the name change. That's useful. We have a couple of students on the research team who are actually from Patterson, and transfer students from Passaic County Community College, and yeah, we give them leeway to do this, but they are focused on Newark, but every once in a while they dive into their own neighborhoods and their own hometowns in a way that I hope, like if the piece of legislation currently stuck in Trenton ever comes to be, that we will be well positioned to contribute to that larger task force investigation, certainly in Newark, but because we have these students dabbling in other places like Patterson, Passaic County. So it's great, thank you.
Silas, you're up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Mark, for this wonderful summary. I know we've been in the middle of this work in Providence for quite some time. I am the inaugural director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Belonging department that was basically created at the very beginning of the year. Before coming to work for Providence, I've been a Providence resident for 32 years. I worked at Tufts University for the Department of Education and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leadership Master Programs. And I directed a school psych program there and in the DLS program. So I was part of Tufts community as a faculty for 13 years, still am affiliated. And these are conversations that are also happening there as Tufts is placed on Indigenous land as well, and also benefits from slave labor of African Americans, which was actually something that I wanted to call attention to, that as we're doing acknowledgements about Indigenous lands, we should also be talking about the folks that were uprooted from their land and then the forced labor that helped to build these sort of higher education empires. I really appreciate the notion around a very focused approach to this work, but also being in conversation with the fact that this is a national issue, because whether things happened in Newark or in Providence in very specific ways, that will add to the conversation. But we also know that people migrated all over the country, no matter what. So throughout our time, since our 1610s to now, people have moved as a result of things like redlining, different economic opportunities, so on and so forth, to the point where we can really continue to try to dive into all of the details about those histories, but it's always going to be murky, because Newark people don't just stay in Newark. Providence people don't just stay in Providence. And so we have to sort of draw a line and say, here's where we have enough information to move to the next phase, or we will be there probably forever. And we don't have another 400 years to be thinking about these kinds of issues. And I'm wondering, as part of that model that you shared, reckoning, acknowledgement, accountability, and redress, that maybe there's also another one in between the redress and reckoning, which is around monitoring and making sure that the things that we end up putting in place is actually doing what we think it is doing. So we can come to an example. I just did a full report that I'll be sharing with the commissioners in Providence for the reparations on the 13 cities that are doing this work. That includes Evanston and Amherst, Massachusetts, St. Louis, Tallahassee, Oklahoma, Sacramento, California, so on and so forth. And there's a pretty clear theme that's emerged that we need to invest in land ownership, right? Because we know folks were dispossessed in every way possible and continue to be dispossessed through very ill policies and laws. So it's not something of the past. This is very much alive and well today. So it's not like we've done harm back then and now we have to repair. We continue to do harm. And in terms of higher ed institutions, we continue to benefit. When I look at numbers of who's doing reparations works in higher education, it's not really centering the African-American indigenous people leading the efforts in most of these institutions. And I'll give an example. You have folks at Tufts, Brown University, all these other places that will get millions of dollars of sponsorship and grants that sustain their careers. And they will go into the communities and they will do research for the benefit of the community. But you know what the community member actually ends up with is like a $50 stop and shop card. That's basically what happens. Meanwhile, we have folks that are getting their salary into the 100,000s, et cetera. They will continue to work in this thing. So I put all of this on the table really just to say that this is also part of the work, is we need to know how people continue to benefit and how that is distributed and shared. Because I come to these meetings and very often who I don't see are the folks that we're trying to support. Right? We don't see the African Americans here. We're not seeing indigenous people in this space. And I'm an immigrant to this land. So I'm indigenous to West Africa, and I can totally understand the plight of attempted erasure and cultural stripping and all of that stuff that has happened as a result of colonization across the world. But I am not of this land. So I really appreciated the land acknowledgement and things like that. But I'm always thinking, how do we move beyond acknowledgement, right, into the redress, and then very intentional monitoring of what's happening from there? Because those numbers that you shared are darn scary, aren't they? I mean, you can see enslavement continuing through incarceration in the numbers. It's not by accident. You can see the challenge of this African-American boy having to climb those stairs. And as a person that is of African descent, it's very much alive. And so I am really hoping that the institutions, Brown in particular, because it's right here in Providence and it knows its history, it has documented history. And I dropped into the chat the African-American Ambassadors Group full report. It is probably the most comprehensive report you're going to find in the country, with almost 700 sources and references, very comprehensive about people of African descent, indigenous people, and then zooming into some of those cultural nuances like the Cape Verdeans that were pushed out of Fox Point, so on and so forth. So if, my view is if you work for like Tufts University and for Brown University, you're required to do that reading. You should do that reading. You should know every bit of how you're involved in this work by virtue of being an agent of the university. There is very little about the indigenous people at Tufts that I didn't make sure that I knew as an immigrant person in that land that continues to benefit from the salaries of the university and from the fact that the university continues to be very much that white mechanism that it was designed to be. I don't believe in predominantly white institutions. I think they're just white institutions because there's no part of its mechanics that is not. And no one can point to me otherwise. They're talking about compositional diversity of people walking on campus. They're not talking about the machinery that keeps the institution going and will continue to go for another whatever number of hundred of years on people's backs. So as the folks, and I agree with you, Mark, and I'll wrap with this, that people are really looking to us, right? When I was working for the Department of Education, I was the one placed in Mattapan, Dorchester area, Massachusetts, doing the work with the community. I was the one doing the research. I was the one actually working with the embassies. The people that are making decisions are far removed from a lot of these processes. So people are looking to us, which is why we need to also double down and say, we are going to be critical, very critical, and call attention to our institutions and say, you know what, we have enough data for us to start doing something. Enough of the talk. We need to do something. There's plenty of evidence that shows that we owe the communities the work that we've been talking about for generations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
I am also looking at the time. I know we're about 5 minutes late and some people had to go at 1 o'clock for classes or for other appointments. So I don't know that we have time for other questions. I'm not sure if there were other questions, but maybe you can just drop them into the chat if you do have them. Mark, thank you. Thanks, Silas, for everything that you just said to kind of keep people's eye as well on, specifically universities and their responsibilities in this work. Mark, thank you for sharing. I actually have loads of questions, but you and I have to have a follow-up conversation about this project. And
Glad to, with any of
you for a second, just to close it out. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that last part.
I said, just turn it over to you, just to,
Oh.
just to close it out. But I want to thank everyone for being here today.
Yes, please. Thank you so much for being here, and for those questions, and for the knowledge. Dr. Pinto, thank you for a million things in what you said, but we've also been hoping, and I have not looked at the report that you linked to yet. I clicked on it. But we've been looking for like the strongest models of these kind of local reports to learn from in creating our own, and to navigate some of those tensions between the institution and the city, between the institution and city government, institution and city residents. So I will check that out and look to that as a model for us going forward. Yeah, and I'm happy to have, I put my email earlier in the chat, but I'll do it again, and just happy to have any sort of follow-ups. One of the things that, when, and Tim Meatman says this too, we say this together a lot, when we were asked by our chancellor to co-lead this project, we both were not thinking about reparations at all. And my knowledge of the movement, its history, its current state was negligible. And what I have learned, and we saw this just now, with Dr. Pinto's and other people's comments, that this is like just a vastly more rich and widespread movement, if you will, a collection of thinking and doing than I would have ever known, 15 months ago, before we really started this. So, so thank you for contributing to that learning, because it is, what kind of drives us and will make whatever we produce in Newark better. So thank you all, and please, yes, let's please follow up.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone for
you.
questions and
Really
comments
appreciate
too. Great to see you.